Good morning. I can't see you out there. The lights are too bright, so I think this is probably a little larger than my typical classroom size. So I teach students with sometimes 15 students in there. We get that much. I'm going to talk to you today about is what we have now what they wrote then. And you'll have to tell me if they get this right on the back, because I have to trust these audiovisual people. I don't know who they are. Are they trustworthy? They're pretty good. Okay. What I'm addressing this morning is the question, is the Bible we have in our hands the same one that the apostles in the New Testament and the prophets in the Old Testament actually wrote? Or are the differences so vast that we really can't trust that the Bible that we have is the one that they wrote back then? Now, what I'm getting to is not just the major issues like, did the Bible originally teach that Jesus rose bodily from the dead? Did it originally teach that he was God in the flesh, that he was born of a virgin? Those extremely important issues. I'm also wrestling with questions like, how do we know that they got it right in all the particulars? Or did they get it right in all the particulars? Sometimes it comes down to a single letter where the meaning can be quite different. Let me give you an illustration. About 800 years ago, there was a monk by the name of Andrew who had gone to what was the equivalent of a theological seminary in that day. He was living in England. When he got all done, the president of the school wrote to a monastery and said, okay, this man is good to go to your monastery. He was one of the more detailed students we had here. In other words, he was anal. That's okay to say here, right? I would hope so. In Texas, sometimes they don't care for that kind of language, but I am not a Texan. Ken, thank you for pointing out that I'm a fourth-generation Californian. I live in Texas, but when somebody says, "Are you from Texas?" then they have a problem. But so Andrew was this monk. He was anal. He comes to this monastery. He meets the abbot, and the abbot sizes him up, and he reads his letter of introduction. He says, "Andrew, I've got just the job for you. I want you to copy out some of our manuscripts of the monastery laws that we have been following for centuries. And you're going to be a scribe. You're going to just copy these out. Make sure to get them as right, as accurate as you can." So he got sitting to work, and a couple hours later, all of a sudden there's the knock on the office door of the abbot. The abbot opens the door, and here's the monk, Andrew. And Andrew says, "Holy Father, I think there's a discrepancy in some of these manuscripts, and they don't seem to be saying exactly the same thing. Do you have some older ones that I can look at?" And the abbot thought for a moment. He said, "Yeah, we do. I can show you some older manuscripts. I'll let you look at those. Now we're getting even older manuscripts. You normally don't let a new monk handle these things. They don't necessarily know how to handle them properly." But the abbot said, "Yeah, I'll let you go ahead and look at those, and you can start transcribing those." 2 hours later, there was a knock on the door again. It was Andrew. "Holy Father, we've got a problem. There's still discrepancies in these manuscripts. Have you got any older ones here? I'm really trying to get to making sure they're absolutely 100% accurate." And so the abbot sized him up a little bit more, and he thought, I think I can trust this guy. He's going to be careful. He said, "We actually have the original documents. They're hidden in an archive vault in the bowels of the library." So they went through this labyrinthian path. And if you've ever been in monasteries in Europe, you know that the paths they go subterranean, they snake around, and they're not very tall, intentionally so that you can't have marauding invaders come in with a large group of people, one person at a time, which is much easier to defend against. And so they finally get down to the bowels of the library into this hidden archives room. And the abbot shows him the original legal documents of the monastery. And so he sets to work. About 45 minutes later, there's 8 hands pounding on the abbot's door. And it's the rest of the monks who are living there. "Holy Father, this new monk has just gone berserk." And so he said, "What's going on?" He said, "Well, you've got to come and see. He's just going nuts. We can't control him." So they all run down this path, snake through the whole serpentine route to get to the archives room, and they find Andrew down there, and he's wailing, he's crying, he's pounding his fist on his desk. He said, "They left out the letter R. They left out the letter R." And the abbot thought, man, this guy really is anal. And he said, "What's the problem with that? The word is supposed to be celebrate." Kind of started here, you guys got it, and then the wings. I think the back center, are you still, what did he say? You must be Southern California transplants. Sometimes the very letters are important to get right. But what we're going to wrestle with is, do we have it right today? Now, you've all heard of Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, a novel that came out a few years ago. And in the Da Vinci Code, he has Sir Lee Teabing, who's the theological gadfly, say the Bible has evolved through countless translations, additions, and revisions. History has never had a definitive version of the book. Well, we've all heard an argument like that. Like, hasn't the Bible been translated and retranslated so many times that you can't possibly get back to the original? And the argument is almost assuming every time the Bible is translated, they must take those manuscripts and burn them. You know, it's really an unreflective, silly argument, and yet most of us don't know how to answer that. That's the one thing you're going to walk away with today, at least, is how to answer that question permanently. And I think you're going to be encouraged by what the evidence really reveals about this. Well, it's not just Dan Brown, who's a novelist, who said this, but there's many others who've argued it. But even as a novelist, here's the interesting thing. My wife and I have 4 boys. We named them after the horses of the apocalypse, the 4 horsemen, death, pestilence, famine, and disease. I think they're solid biblical names, but nevertheless, these boys, 2 of them were in college when Dan Brown's novel came out, and one was at Georgia Tech and the other at the University of Texas. And that semester, there was a professor at each one of their schools who said, this book, Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, has proved that Christianity is rooted in myth. A novel has proved that. Remarkable. These, at major universities in this country where they're making that kind of a statement, that tells you what has become of our world, that evidence doesn't count for much anymore. We need to know what the facts are. And of course, everybody has instant access to just about any question answer they could possibly ever conceive of just through the internet. You just Google your question, there you go. You get 40,000 places that'll give you an answer. But whether it's the right answer, whether it's based on real evidence, is a different question. So I'm going to try to give you some of that. Well, there's 2 attitudes as we wrestle with this whole thing that we need to avoid. The first attitude is an attitude of total despair. There's no need for us to come to the Scriptures and say, we can't possibly tell what the original text said, even though we don't have the original documents anymore. That's the attitude of a guy like Dan Brown. That's the attitude of somebody like Robert Funk, who headed up the Jesus Seminar. You may have heard of this group. They had 8 years, 84 scholars, casting lots, basically, to see what Jesus said. They put red beads into a jar, which means this goes back to the words of Jesus. Pink beads were, well, at least the concept goes back to Jesus. Gray and then black is, there's no way this goes back to the historical Jesus. And they ended up having a Gospels that had 18% going back to the historical Jesus. The rest was made up by the church later, in their view. That's an attitude of total despair. But there's an equally pernicious attitude on the opposite side of it, and that's the attitude of absolute certainty. And we have groups that hold to that, Christian groups that say, absolutely exactly what's in my Bible is what was printed in or written in the original text. Well, we're going to deal with both of these attitudes and show you that neither one is helpful. But let me begin by showing you not just a novelist, but a bona fide biblical scholar named Bart Ehrman. Now, he's written a book called Misquoting Jesus, the story behind who changed the Bible and why. And Bart Ehrman is a Moody Bible Institute graduate. He's a Wheaton College graduate. Then he got his master's degree at Princeton Seminary and his doctorate at Princeton Seminary. He and I have been friends for, I think, 27, maybe going on 28 years now. And he was an evangelical when he started out at Princeton. And as he went through a number of stages in his studies, he became a theological liberal. He denied the bodily resurrection of Christ. And then ultimately he became an agnostic. And today he would say that if there is a God, it is certainly not the God of the Bible. So I'd say he's gone through a serious theological shift. And he said the thing that started to move him in that direction was the fact that the manuscripts that we have mistakes in them, and they don't duplicate exactly the original wording. And his argument is, if God took the trouble to inspire the original text, surely he would have taken the trouble to preserve that text in the manuscripts. Since all the manuscripts have mistakes, he didn't do it, therefore the Bible is not inspired. So I think that's a fairly convoluted logic, but we're going to deal with the evidence here in just a minute. So in Misquoting Jesus, here's what he says. Not only do we not have the originals, We don't have the first copies of the originals. That's true. We don't even have copies of the originals or copies of the copies of the copies of the originals. I don't know if that's true, but assuming it is, let's say, okay, that's probably the case. Well, his attitude has become one of total despair, and he is a bona fide textual critic. Now, textual criticism is the discipline that tries to determine exact wording of the original text when we don't have the original manuscripts anymore. In other words, there are plenty of monk Andrews out there who do this kind of work. It's about 24 of us who are extremely anal, and you kind of shut us up in little corners and don't, feed us and keep us in the dark, that kind of thing. And most of these scholars are really, really eccentric. I'm not eccentric at all, so just wanted to let you know that to begin with. Well, absolute certainty is an equally wrong attitude. This is held to tenaciously by many Christians, and it's as if they say, and some of them do say this, if the King James Bible was good enough for St. Paul, it's good enough for me. I've actually heard them say this kind of thing. Well, I don't think English existed in the first century, but okay, that's fine. This view is destructive of the Christian faith. And the reason it is because there's zero evidence to suggest that the King James was re-inspired. You wait 1,600 years after the New Testament books are written, and those were inspired. And then, in an English translation, God does inspiration again. That actually is more of a Catholic notion than it is a Protestant notion. And when I discuss things with King James only people, I say, well, I didn't realize you were a Roman Catholic. And they go, what? What are you talking about? I'm not a Catholic. They really despise Catholicism, and so they don't realize that they're following a similar kind of a method. But it's destructive of the Christian faith as well, because faith without reason is not a reasonable faith, and it's not a truly Christian faith. Once you start with a position of dogma, then when there's cracks in your armor, the whole edifice just falls apart, comes crumbling down. So we need to be very careful about this. So what I'm going to tell you today is not that we don't have any idea what the original text is, and I'm also not going to tell you that we have absolute certainty of what the original text is. But just because we don't have absolute certainty, we don't have to have total despair. There's a broad range in the middle, and it's much closer to absolute certainty is where we need to be. Well, there's three questions that I want to answer this morning for you. The first is a question of quantity. How many scribal alterations are there? And by that, what I mean is, how many places do we have the scribes who've actually changed the wording of the original text of the New Testament? Textual critics count this down to the very letter level. So if there's a place where it's just a different spelling for, say, the name John, which is Ioannes in Greek, and some manuscripts have Ioannes with two N's, and some have it with one N. Each time we see that in a passage, that counts as a textual variant. So spelling variations, word order differences, when they add a word here or there or take away a word out, or sometimes a whole verse or even more than one verse, those are all textual variants. The second issue is quality. What kinds of textual variations are there? And we're going to wrestle with that because that's an extremely important issue. And finally, the bottom line is the question of orthodoxy. What theological beliefs depend on textually suspect passages? I think we all would like to know, is the resurrection of Christ secure, or does every place where the New Testament speaks about him as being raised from the dead, are there manuscripts that say, no, he wasn't, or he's still in the grave, or something like that? You'd like to know that, wouldn't you? I think that's kind of important for our faith, so that's what we'll wrestle with. Well, let me start with a preliminary question, which is, don't we have the original New Testament anymore? The answer is, no, we don't. All the books of the New Testament, all 27, were written to various churches, and by the end of the 2nd century, they had all turned to dust. They were written on papyrus. Papyrus is a very fragile material. It has the consistency of a paper grocery bag, if you will. And unless it's in a dry climate, it's going to deteriorate and just fall apart within 100 years at least. All of the papyri that we have found from the ancient world come from either Egypt or Qumran around the Dead Sea, a very dry area, or from Herculaneum, which is at the bottom of Mount Vesuvius at Pompeii, where you had the volcano that erupted, and we found papyri in and among the lava remains, actually, that had not been completely burned up. So it has to be a dry climate for it to last hundreds of years. And our New Testament documents would have been written on papyri. They all disappeared by then. But they were also copied many times before they disappeared, and so that's what we're dealing with. Not only have they disappeared, but all the manuscripts, every single one of the manuscripts disagrees with the other manuscripts.